Welcome, 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 my lovely brothers and sisters. Welcome to the fifth part of this 13 parts counting informational series about social engineering and covert governance. The subtitle for today is the Playout Collapse as Self-Consuming Logic. Let us start quickly. It is 15 pages that I will read. I skip the parts where she is doing a rehearsal of the text because that saves some time. And yeah, you can download this article for yourself through the website links that I have placed in the text box. Please go to these links and then you can download this article completely for free and read it yourselves in your own pace. So let's go to screen share so that everyone can read along with me. And let us start. All right, the Playout collapse as self-consuming logic. Here the system reaches its final stage. Collapse becomes performative, self-reinforcing, and monetized. Collapse is no longer an event, it is a governance style, surveillance, misinformation, and ideological extremism no longer function as breakdowns but as operating protocols. This subsection outlined how mass psychologies become decoupled from reality and how nihilism and tribalism or authoritarianism fill the void left by degraded meaning structures. Any emergent coherence is neutralized or co-opted. At this stage, the system becomes closed, not just functionally, but energetically. But energetically. Severed from higher order inputs that could restore adaptation. In sum, across section 2, we have tracked the transition from momentum for systemic change to the locked-in trajectory of collapse. The United States, as the primary case study, has moved through the entire arc, from early possibility through institutional decay to a final stage where collapse becomes its governing logic. However, this framework is not a call for despair, it is a call for accurate positioning. It is in this clear-eyed recognition that the role of the resilience pioneers, what we call the first of many, becomes not just relevant but essential. The onset, momentum for change. This stage represented the final window where coherent civilizational redirection could have occurred from within the existing system. This possibility rested on the ability to awaken public awareness, reform governing mechanisms, and respond to early warnings from ecological, economic, and cultural feedback systems. For those alive during this window, especially in Europe and US, the call was to organize toward a more conscious civilization, but the cultural bandwidth and institutional integrity necessary to make this shift were not sufficiently present. Still, some did begin their preparation. These early actors sensed what was coming and quietly began positioning themselves outside legacy paradigms, building the foundations of what would later become resilience hubs and multidimensional future platforms. The solidification pattern lock-in. At this point, course correction was no longer feasible with the mainstream pathways in the US, partisan entrenchment, institutional capture, and culture war logics overtook any real systematic adaptation. So in Europe, while some nations retained functional governance, the broader European Union began showing signs of the same trend: bureaucratic stagnation, rising far-right populism, and the erosion of public trust. Here, resilience pioneers faced a different task: to detach strategically from the failing system without falling into disengagement or despair. This is where resilience hubs began to emerge: localized future alignment architectures of coherence that operate with long-range orientation and multi-domain awareness. These are not survivalist compounds, but labs of the future environments where new educational systems, multidimensional psychology, post-collapse social design, and subtle extraterrestrial awareness can be safely prototyped. The Playout collapse as protocol. We now enter the fully locked-in phase where collapse is the system. The US exemplifies this through its performance of governance as a spectacle, its entropic information environment, and its inability to generate cohesion or even basic future literacy. In the European Union, fragmentation intensifies as external pressures, migration, climate shocks, economic disparity, and geopolitical realignment reveal the underlying lack of spiritual and systemic coherence. This is the era where the pioneers step forward. They are no longer waiting for reform. They are not petitioning a corrupted order. They are living as if the next civilization is already in motion. They are doing this by hosting micro-environments of psychological coherence and high-trust collaboration, by prototyping new workflows that generate value beyond money and identity, and also by developing new standards of interaction beyond gendered dynamics or power-based approval structures, and also through mapping alternative timelines and multidimensional developmental routes. And as last, facilitating contact-aware protocols that integrate non-human intelligence with systemic design. They are not many yet, but they are the first of many, and they are not waiting for permission. Europe and the US parallel yet divergent roles. In the US, pioneers must work with a degraded collective field where mainstream reality has collapsed into spectacle and conspiracy. Here, hubs must function as oases of clarity, offering meaning, structure, and developmental scaffolding in a context where all these are being deconstructed. In this field, contact-aware resilience and emotional maturity are vital. In Europe, especially in regions with cultural memory of cooperation and long-term planning, the work focuses more on reviving complexity and initiating parallel systems in education, governance, and culture that bypass the collapsing consensus without direct confrontation. Both regions have vital roles. Europe is to preserve the continuity of civilization memory. The US may birth radical innovations in collapse-resistant architectures. Together, the transnational pioneers from the early mesh of a post-collapse civilization layer, what we call planetary level 1, this is the context in which non-human intelligence, Contact and multidimensional interaction must now be framed not from within a healthy system capable of observing and integrating and absorbing new complexity, but within a distorted reality field that reacts to higher input with collapse reflexes, distortion, fragmentation, or weaponization. With this backdrop in place, we are now prepared to examine a far older and often misunderstood intervention in human development known as the Aten encounter. It stands as an early deliberate attempt by non-human intelligences to reshape human civilization not by force but through cultural seeding, symbolic restructuring, and divine re-encoding. As we will explore, this event was not about ancient worship, it was about information architecture. It was a contact episode aimed at altering the relationship between power, divinity, and human identity, and like now, the field was not ready. But unlike then, today a different outcome is possible because the resilience pioneers are watching with eyes open. An early example of non-human intelligent social engineering, the Aten encounter. The religious revolution enacted by Pharaoh Akhenaten, which is in the Urantia book known as Akhenaton. And so, therefore, I am advising you to go to the website of urantiafoundation.org, type in Akhenaton, Ichaton, and then you can come to a different in-depth storyline of what she is mentioning here. So Pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE remains one of the most profound and enigmatic episodes in ancient Egyptian history, traditionally interpreted as a philosophical shift toward monotheism via solar worship. And this article proposes a radical alternative. And I also want to say in the coming live Urantia book readings, when I go through the entire story of Makifenta Melchizedek and his missionaries and how they brought the Salem teachings, eventually there is a storyline also coming in play about Akhenaton, and I also will read eventually a live book reading about Akhenaton. So keep the channel in your mind, and yeah, I don't know, I lost track here. Okay, yeah. Traditionally interpreted as a philosophical shift toward monotheism via solar worship, this article proposes a radical alternative. That the Aten, often depicted as a radiant solar disk, may have been a non-human craft or consciousness technology. Okay, this is how she is interpreting this. This framework, while speculative, offers a more coherent explanation for the sudden and total upheaval of Egypt's religious structure, the construction of a new capital, and the unique iconography of the Amarna period. The Aten, a solar disk or a contact phenomenon. In standard Egyptology, the Aten is described as the visible sun, deified and elevated as the singular object of worship under Akhenaten. I call him from now on Akhenaton, no longer Akhenaten. And the Aten is in actuality the Almighty I Am, known as God the Heavenly Father. The god is depicted as a flat, radiant disk from which beams of light extend downward, ending in hands, some of which hold the so-called Ankh symbol of life. This iconography diverges dramatically from the anthropomorphic depictions of earlier gods. It lacks a face, form, or mythology in the usual sense. Instead, it suggests a transcendent abstract force, or perhaps something else, a disc shaped craft or consciousness interface radiating energy not only symbolically but literally. The visual parallels to modern sightings of disc-shaped aerial craft emitting radiant energy are striking. Numerous accounts across history, including modern so-called UFO cases, describe luminescent hovering discs that project beams of light, create altered states of consciousness, and are experienced as intelligent presence rather than inert machines. So the radical reform of Akhenaten, better known as Akhenaton, evidence of an inciting event. The reign of Akhenaton stands out in ancient history as one of the most dramatic and enigmatic episodes of cultural and religious transformation ever recorded, often explained as an eccentric king's philosophical experiment or a politically motivated centralization of priestly power. Akhenaton reforms reveal qualities and a scale that resist narrow interpretations. When examined closely, they suggest the possibility of an inciting event, an experience so profound that it reshaped the very foundations of perception, identity, and governance. Akhenaton did not merely adjust the state religion, he abolished the entire Egyptian pantheon, gods who had been venerated for over 1,000 years, integrated into every aspect of civic, agricultural, and spiritual life. This was not a gradual evolution of belief, but a sudden, uncompromising rupture. The act itself destabilized the immense power held by the established priesthoods, especially the priests of Amun, and the dismantled the theological structure that had sustained Egypt's cultural continuity across dynasties. So Akhenaton, then moved the capital to Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, a location previously uninhabited and chosen for its symbolic alignment with the sun's daily journey, declaring it sacred ground dedicated exclusively to the Aten, or better known to the source and creator of the living light and life. He built an entirely new city from scratch, an extraordinarily logistical and economic feat that underscores both the urgency and totality of his vision. Perhaps most strikingly, Akhenaton commissioned a radical departure in art and cultural symbolism. Traditional Egyptian art, which had followed strict conventions of proportion and idealization for centuries, was replaced by depictions of the royal family with elongated skulls, narrow limbs, and distinctly androgynous features. The king himself appeared in these artworks in ways that blurred the lines between masculine and feminine, divine and human. This transformation hints at more than stylistic innovation. It suggests a fundamental shift in how the ruling elite perceive themselves or wish to be perceived by their subjects. Some scholars have speculated about possible genetic conditions or deliberate biological alteration, but viewed through the lens of social engineering, these depictions may also reflect an attempt to signal or embody a new hybridized identity influenced by an external source. The nature of the Aten itself deepens the mystery, unlike Ra, Osiris, or Thoth, gods rich with myth, personality, and anthropomorphic form. The Aten was abstract, impersonal, and incorporeal. It had no mythological backstory, no divine lineage, and no voice. It was pure radiant light and omnipresent disk. So it was the Almighty I am, the source and creator of the living light, whose significance lay not in narrative or image, but in direct experience of its illumination. In this, the Aten resembles less a traditional deity and more an abstract principle or universal intelligence, something closer to an energetic phenomenon than a figure from human imagination. Such a sweeping reordering of society, aesthetics, and theology cannot easily be explained as the result of ideology alone. The scale and suddenness suggests something more immediate, a contact experience with a non-human intelligence, an encounter so profound that it rendered the existing religious frameworks obsolete and compelled Ignaton to rebuild the entire cultural um, edifice around this new revelation. The king's insistence on the uniqueness and universality of the Aten, coupled with the rejection of all prior gods, points to an event whose impact was not merely philosophical but existential, an experience that reshaped the ruler's perception of reality itself. Whether this contact was physical, visionary, or some combination remains unknown. Yet the effects, radical religious monotheism, architectural realignment, the reinvention of royal identity, and the erasure of centuries of tradition point toward an extraordinary stimulus beyond what political ambition or theological speculation alone could produce. Through this lens, the Amarna period becomes not simply a curious deviation in Egyptian history, but an early recorded example of civilizational level social engineering initiated by what may have been an encounter with an intelligence outside the boundaries of established human culture and belief. This episode, however brief, foreshadows patterns seen millennia later. The fusion of contact phenomena, transformative ideology, and tightly controlled governance to redirect the course of human civilization. Ignaton's reforms cannot be explained solely as philosophical or political acts. He established the entire he abolished, the entire Egyptian pantheon. He moved the capital to Akhetaten, the modern day Amarna, and the Aten was never personified, and he commissioned new art and inscriptions that broke with all previous aesthetic and theological norms. This scale of transformation implies more than ideology. It suggests a direct event, a contact experience with a non-human intelligence that was so profound it shattered existing religious frameworks. The Aten as non-human craft or consciousness system. To truly understand the singularity of Ignaton's religious revolution, it is helpful to reconsider the Aten not merely as an abstract theological construct, but as something far more radical, a manifestation of non-human technology, of consciousness interacting directly with the human world. Traditional Egyptology describes the Aten as the visible disk of the sun, symbolizing divine light and universal presence, yet this interpretation struggles to explain why Akhenaton abandoned millennia of rich mythological tradition, gods with complex personalities, sacred narratives, and elaborate temples for an almost sterile abstraction, a radiant disk with articulate rays that reach toward the royal family, each ray ending not in flame or hand, but in the unmistakable loop of the so-called Ankh, the so-called ancient Egyptian sign of life. Reframed through the lens of contact and multidimensional systems, the Aten disk begins to resemble something strikingly different: a hovering craft or conscious energy system, a bioplasmic or energetic intelligence, a multidimensional interface. In this context, the so-called Ankh shapes at the end of the Aten's rays acquire profound significance, far from being mere decorative flourishes or abstract symbols of life. They may represent frequency keys, energetic codes, or life pattern transmissions. The artistic convention of showing these rays delivering the so-called Ankhs directly into the nostrils of the royal family hints at something closer to a technology of transformation, a process intended to modify consciousness, biology, or maybe both. Akhenaton himself then emerges not only as a theological innovator, but as a host, conduit, or hybridized receptor, a human being transformed by direct interaction with this Atenic intelligence. The androgynous art style, elongated skulls, and fluid depictions of gender in the royal family may reflect not mere aesthetic choice, but a deliberate representation of altered states of being, an attempt to visually encode the blending of human and non-human essence. This interpretation reframes the entire Amarna episode. The religious revolution becomes not simply a political power play or philosophical experiment, but a civilizational contact event, a moment when a non-human consciousness system, whether craft, energy field, or multidimensional intelligence, interfaced with humanity, transmitting an experiential living code that Akhenaton and his circle sought to anchor into culture, art, and governance. Seen this way, the Aten cult foreshadows later phenomena described in modern contact literature: direct cognitive downloads, energetic transmissions, and the creation of so-called hybridized figures who serve as bridges between human society and a larger cosmic order. It also illustrates an early and sophisticated form of social engineering, a deliberate top-down attempt to restructure an entire civilization around a new model of reality, sparked by contact that transcended language and tradition. While the physical Aten has long since disappeared and the Amarna period was violently suppressed in its aftermath, the traces remain in art and architecture and in the striking break from all religious forms that came before. By reconsidering the Aten as a non-human, so-called craft or consciousness system, we open a window into the possibility that what occurred in ancient Egypt was not only a theological rebellion, but the first recorded attempt to adapt society to the reality of multidimensional contact. The flat disk reaching out with articulate light rays could easily be interpreted as a so-called hovering craft with conscious energy emission systems, a bioplasmic intelligence communicating through symbolic light language, or a multidimensional vehicle interfacing with human cognition through radiant transmission bypassing speech, or a myth and instead imprinting direct experience. In this context, the so-called Ankh at the end of the race may not be a symbol, but rather a representation of a life code or frequency key being transmitted into select individuals. Akhenaten, or better known as Ignaton, may have been one such individual, a host, conduit, or maybe hybridized receptor for the Athenic intelligence. Then we go to the relocation to Amarna, could be a landing site or beacon point. One of the most striking and historically perplexing choices Ignaton made was the decision to build an entirely new capital city, Akhetaten, known today as Amarna, in an isolated stretch of desert with no previous cultural, religious, or economic significance. Historians have long debated why the pharaoh would abandon the powerful and symbolically charged centers of Thebes and Memphis, uprooting the machinery of state to a barren, seemingly unremarkable location. Viewed through the lens of political history alone, the move appears radical, even irrational. Yet if we reconsider this decision in the context of contact, where the Aten is understood, not just as a theological concept, but as a tangible, maybe non-human so-called craft or consciousness system, the choice begins to reveal a deeper logic. Well, to be in this case more precise, Ignaton came in contact with the teachings of Salem. And so this is in actuality based on the history of Ignaton in confused history here on earth known as Akhenaten. Ignaton came into contact with the Salem teachings, and this changing of civilization came forth of implementing the teachings of Salem into Egypt. It becomes plausible to suggest that Amarna itself was not chosen at random, but directly linked to the inciting event that sparked Ignaton's religious revolution. The location may have been where the Aten so-called craft first manifested in physical or energetic form, or where it appeared repeatedly in ways so undeniable that it marked the landscape as sacred. In this scenario, the city Akhetaten was not merely a symbolic center of worship, but a literal interface point, a place where the dimensional architecture of the Athenic intelligence could anchor itself into human civilization. There are accounts preserved in inscriptions and later traditions that suggests Ignaton chose the site based on a vision or as the result of a profound revelation. He himself described the place as chosen by the Aten. And again, the Aten, I think we need to interpret it as the Most High himself, so known as the source and creator of the living light and life, for many still known as God, the Heavenly Father, and indicated that the city was built where the Aten wished to be. In the context of contact, this so-called wish could be understood not as poetic language, but as the direct instruction received, maybe telepathically, perceptually, or via a cognitive download that impressed upon the king both the urgency and the precise geographical location required. Further supporting this interpretation is the unique orientation of the city itself. One of the most revealing architectural features of Amarna is its deliberate orientation. The main ceremonial axis of the city was aligned to frame and track the rising and setting sun at a specific points in the solar year. Unlike older Egyptian capitals, which evolved organically around temples, riverside docks, and pre-existing sacred sites, Amarna was designed in a single planned gesture. This alignment was not arbitrary. It symbolically and practically anchored the city to the daily and seasonal movements of the Aten, the visible sun, so-called disk worshipped as the supreme singular divine presence. In practice, this meant that as the sun rose over the eastern cliffs and set across the western desert, its light would fall directly along processional ways, temple courtyards, and major gates, illuminating statues and altars in precise patterns. From a symbolic perspective, this design expressed Akhenaton's theological vision. The Aten was not a hidden god dwelling in darkness or mystery, but a radiant force whose presence could be experienced directly through light and space. The city itself became a kind of living temple, its architecture an instrument to receive and display divine energy each dawn and dusk. From a speculative perspective, especially if we interpret the Aten as a non-human so-called craft or energetic intelligence, this alignment takes on even deeper significance. It could have been intended to maximize resonance with energetic fields, celestial cycles, or contact windows, creating conditions that favored communication or conscious interface by aligning Amarna with solar movements. Akhenaten, or better known as Akhenaton, may have been attempting to harmonize human-built structures with cosmic or interdimensional dynamics. Yes, that was something he in actuality was trying to do through the teachings of Salem, who came forth from Machiaventa Melchizedek, turning the entire city into a monumental receiver and transmitter for the Atenic presence. In either case, whether symbolic or functional, this deliberate orientation underlines how deeply Akhenaten's or Akhenaton's project went beyond theology alone. It wove cosmic order, daily ritual, and built environment into a single coherent system aimed at transforming human consciousness and society. This deliberate alignment may have been intended to facilitate resonance with the Atenic presence, serving as a beacon, receiver, or stabilizer for the interface, so-called interface between human consciousness and a higher dimensional system, which is in actuality the Most High himself. If we see the Aten not simply as an abstract ideal, but as a real energetic or technological intelligence, then Amarna becomes something far more complex than a royal vanity project or a political maneuver against entrenched priesthoods. It emerges as an unprecedented civilizational experiment, the construction of an entire city designed as a so-called landing site, transmitter, or energetic focal point for sustained so-called contact. Akhenaten's or Akhenaton's insistence on relocating the seat of power thus becomes an act of profound strategic and spiritual significance rather than an eccentric departure from tradition. In this light, the relocation to Amarna illustrates an early and sophisticated model of social engineering driven by contact. Rather than merely adapting beliefs, Akhenaten or Akhenaton sought to reshape the very fabric of daily life, governance, and spatial design around a living relationship with a non-human intelligence, yes, which is the teachings of Salem coming from Machiaventa Melchizedek, who himself was not really a human being at all. He just looked as a human being, but as a matter of fact, he was a materialized being. The goal may have been to create a city where the veil between human and Athenic consciousness could be thinned, a sacred zone where divine presence was not mediated by myth but experienced directly through architectural, energetic, and ritual alignment. Though the physical city of Amarna would later be abandoned and systematically erased from memory, the very decision to found it testifies to the depth of Akhenaten's, or better known Ikhnaton's, conviction, and possibly to the reality of the contact event that compelled him. Seen this way, the empty desert was never truly empty. It was chosen because it resonated with something extraordinary that had once appeared there, something that left a mark not only on stone and sand, but on the trajectory of human cultural evolution itself. Akhenaten's, or Ikhnaton's, decision to build his new capital at Amarna, an empty desert area with no prior significance, has long puzzled historians. But if one considers the possibility that the location was connected to maybe the contact event, or the Aten so-called craft manifested, landed, or appeared repeatedly there, or the energetic conditions of Amarna favor direct interface with the Athenic intelligence, so with God himself, then the decision became less mysterious. So some descriptions suggests that Akhenaten chose the site based on a vision or as a result of a revelation. Yes, the teachings of Salem. If the Aten was a real presence, he may have been instructed telepathically or perceptually to found a city where the dimensional architecture of the so-called craft could be anchored into human civilization. Well, I came to understand through the Urantia book that Machiavelli Melchizedek has had contact with Ikhnaton and also with all the known prophets from old A's and days. So the biological signature of contact, one of the most striking and often debated aspects of the Amarna period, lies not only in its theology and architecture, but in the physical representations of Akhenaten and his royal family. The artistic depictions from this time break dramatically from centuries of highly formalized Egyptian conventions. Instead of idolized, rigidly proportionate figures that had symbolized divine order and continuity, the art of Amarna presents bodies that seem deliberately distorted, elongated skulls, unusually narrow or rounded limbs, protruding bellies, and a strikingly androgynous appearance that blurs the conventional boundaries of male and female. The faces to show wide, almost forward-facing eyes, giving them a gaze that feels both distant and intensely direct. These features have puzzled scholars for generations. The traditional academic interpretations holds that these stylistic choices, perhaps a symbolic expression of Akhenaten's theological revolution, emphasizing the unity of male and female, or the spiritual illumination believed to come through communion with the Aten, or better known as the Almighty I Am. However, when viewed through the lens of a contact-based hypothesis, these features take on a different and potentially more literal significance. Rather than mere artistic symbolism, they may represent actual biological transformations occurring in those closest to the Athenic presence. So this framework suggests that contact with a non-human intelligence or prolonged exposure to a powerful energetic or multidimensional field could lead to epigenetic changes, alterations in endocrine function, or even intentional hybridization through selective interbreeding. In this light, the elongated skulls might not simply be symbolic of divine status or higher consciousness, but a physical manifestation of genetic or neurological modification intended to facilitate deeper cognitive resonance with the Athenic intelligences. Similarly, the androgynous forms could reflect biological, perhaps hormonal, recalibration or deliberate manipulation of sexual characteristics to produce a physiological unique caste distinct from the general population, one better suited to act as intermediaries or so-called hosts for a maybe non-terrestrial field of consciousness. Further, the art of the Amarna period is not limited to Akhenaten alone. It extends to depictions of his wife, Nefertiti, and their daughters, who also appear with elongated heads and similarly fluid gender traits. This repetition suggests a patterned phenomenon rather than the quirks of a single individual's physiology or a purely symbolic royal iconography. The possibility that exposure to the Athenic intelligence could transform both body and mind resonates with patterns observed in modern contact accounts, where individuals often report lasting physiological or psychological changes after so encounters, shifts in hormonal balance. Heightened sensory perception or even subtle morphological differences in both ancient and modern contexts. Contact is described not merely as an exchange of information, but as an energetic or biological process that reconfigures the organism itself to enable deeper interface. Seen through this lens, the unusual artistic style of Amarna becomes not just atheistic or an I mean aesthetic revolution, but a visual archive of transformation, an attempt to record in stone and pigment the lived reality of those who have become conduits for something beyond ordinary human experience. Rather than mythology alone, the depictions may preserve evidence of a historical moment when the boundaries between human biology and non-human influence briefly and dramatically blurred, leaving traces that still compel investigation thousands of years later. The depictions of Akhenaten and his so-called royal family during this period are famously unusual. So, some researchers have speculated that these were stylized artistic choices, but from a contact-based hypothesis, they could represent epigenetic changes, energetic recalibrations, or maybe even interbreeding with non-human source, specifically one with Athenic genetic or maybe neurological influence. Who knows? Implications and future inquiry. Rather than worshipping a symbolic sun, Akhenaten or Ignaton may have responded to a non-human intelligence manifesting as a radiant disk, a so-called craft or consciousness hybrid could designed to interface with human perception and transform collective paradigms. His sudden overhaul of Egypt's theological structure, the founding of a new city, and the anomalous depictions of his lineage all suggests direct transmission, not just ideology. In this reading, Aten was a craft and Akhenaten or Ignaton its first maybe human anchor. Reframing Aten as a so-called craft and Akhenaten's religious revolution as a contact event radically alters how we understand ancient history. And please go to the Urantia book for a far more in-depth understanding about Ignaton slash Akhenaten. And then, yeah. Okay, then this is a summary. Yeah, okay. This is something you can read yourself. This hypothesis invites serious re-examination of not only Akhenaten's legacy, but the true origin of human religious transformation events across cultures and epochs. What we cannot overlook is the ontological implication of rather than worshipping a symbolic sun, Akhenaten/Ignaton may have responded to a so-called non-human intelligence manifesting as a radiant disk, a maybe craft consciousness hybrid designed to interface with human perception and initiate a recalibration of civilization. His abrupt theological shift, the construction of an entirely new capital city, and the stylized depictions of himself and his offspring all suggest something more than ideological innovation. They imply direct contact, a paradigm transmission, not just a philosophical one. And then in this light, the atom was likely a technological intelligence platform, a radiant vehicle, or a consciousness node engineered to entrain human awareness toward a new civilizational format. Akhenaten/Ignaton then was not merely a heretic king, but the first known human anchor for a contact-based consciousness reformatting initiative. Reframing Aten this way has profound implications for both ancient history and the near future. And then there is this summary. You can read it yourself. So this hypothesis invites a radical re-examination of both ancient history and present-day multidimensional contact. More importantly, it holds relevance now because we are entering a mirrored threshold. We too are in a moment where the collapse of inherited paradigms invites a complete restructuring of how we relate to power, intelligence, and meaning. Like in Akhenaten's or Ignaton's time, a new organizing intelligence is seeking expression not through religion, but through planetary alignment, multidimensional coherence, and advanced system design. The current wave of contact, if understood properly, is not about disclosure or spectacle. It is about designing the next version of human civilization by those who are prepared to receive and actualize the signal. This is where baseline communities, the resilience hubs, and planetary pioneers come in. They are today's breakaway independent community makers, the experimental communities of tomorrow, initiated not through decree, but through pattern recognition, inner coherence, and systemic alignment. So the Aten example serves as a case study in what happens when advanced intelligences attempt to recalibrate a civilization's trajectory by seeding new symbolic and systemic frameworks. It shows us both the potential and the risk. Without sufficient readiness in the surrounding field, even the most profound contact can be lost to distortion, backlash, and eventual erasure. As we move forward, the question is no longer whether contact is happening, it is whether we are prepared to build the structures of integration to anchor the signal, and to do so without falling into the ancient traps of worship, hierarchy, or mythologized control. And with this said, I have come to the end of reading these 15 papers. Not tomorrow, but Wednesday, I will proceed with section 3, the New World Order 2.0, a new type of resurgence and the future of global governance. Randi Green is building up this entire article. So all that we have went through is just an introduction, and now we come to the actual part and point of this article, and then she is building up, and then at the end we get some ideas and yeah, what you could say or see as solutions. Okay, I go out, I leave this screen share, go back to this image first. I also want to say that it is a wise idea to read this article for yourself by downloading it freely from the mentioned website links. Read it in your own pace and ask the help of the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of Truth, and ask them to also bring discernment while you are reading this article. Ask the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of Truth to help you to get a more in-depth understanding and clarification of what this article is teaching us, is telling us, and what its in-depth message is. Okay, then we go to the last, which is the closing section of this reading for today. I want to say thank you so much for listening and reading along with me. And I wish you all a beautiful and joyful day filled with a lot of love, wisdom and truth, and ministry, and thus service to your fellow brothers and sisters as Jesus has taught us to do so. And as last I say, let us listen to Ben's sound. He has a beautiful piece of music called Evolution. I see you with a new Urantia Live book reading. God bless you.